Hello everyone, my name is Jackson and I will be presenting today with my groupmate Saraf Mustasin. And our topic is individualism, collectivism and opportunism, a cultural perspective on transaction cost economics. This paper challenges the transaction cost economics paradigm's oversimplification of the notion that opportunism is a fundamental aspect of human nature. The researchers suggest that earlier cultural indoctrination of individualism collectivism influences opportunistic propensity. Particularly, they believe that collectivists engage in more opportunistic behavior in intergroup interactions than individuals do in intergroup interactions. Culture serves as a check on opportunism. Transaction cost economics, first put forth by Coase and then made popular by Williamson, had emerged as a key paradigm in social science research. A healthy regard for opportunism is essential to understanding the purpose served by complex modes of economic organizations. Individuals will not reliably self-enforce promises, but will deviate the letter and spirit of an agreement when it suits their purposes, making opportunism one of its fundamental elements. Williamson offered the most well-known and frequently critiqued version of opportunistic assumption. By opportunism, I mean dishonestly pursuing one's own interest. Opportunism is the deliberate attempt to deceive, distort, disguise, obscure, or otherwise confuse someone. It specifically relates to the incomplete or distorted revelation of any information. On two key fronts, transaction cost economics' assumption of opportunism has been challenged. First, it has been shown that social interactions and institutions with shared values, conventions, and more greatly restrain economic behavior in general or optimistic behavior in particular. The idea of opportunism has also been criticized for portraying a limited and under-socialized understanding of human motivation. These critics contended that commitment, cooperation, and respect for authority are all part of human motive within an organization, and that these alternative motives serve as a self-regulating force that prevent individuals from acting opportunistically. Opportunistic inclination does not imply that a person will always act in an advantageous manner in all situations. Instead, a party's optimistic propensity is more likely to be activated when transacting parties believe or feel conflict of interest in situations where each party is trying to maximize its own interest by taking advantage of the other party. Culture and prior conditioning. Either the internal subjective reality of the individual actors or the external objective universe can be used to define culture. They suggested in their sociological theory of action that the actor may view culture, in terms of beliefs and values, as objects such much like other situational objects like natural resources to organize and address. On the other hand, when viewed from a micro psychological perspective, culture may be a constitutive part of the actor. Much like other internal attributes such as perception, motivations, and attitudes. Two general rationales can be offered in support of culture's prior conditioning effect on an individual's opportunistic propensity. The first is the continuous enculturation, that is, the transmission of culture values and norms from the old to the new generation by formal and informal means such as child rearing and school education. In second, values are largely stable as a result of culture conditioning and are consistently varied across countries. Individualism, collectivism, and opportunistic propensity. The cultural dimension of individualism collectivism is particularly appropriate for specifying human opportunistic propensity because it offers insight into culturally conditioned views of self-identity and the primacy of self versus group interest seeking. both of which affect individuals' cognitive, effectiveness, and behavioral orientations towards others. Individualism collectivism illustrates how shared collective identities function as an embedding factor which not only influences members' organizational behaviors but also determines what is proper and desirable, capturing the degree to which people from different cultures are embedded in distinct collectivities. According to social identity theory, a person's self identity consists of two components: a personal identity and a social identity. Personal identity consists of ideological characteristics such as attributes, abilities, traits, and interests, whereas social identity comprises various social affiliations as group membership. The personal and social identities, however, are not equally important but are structured in an identity hierarchy of a silence. The more relevant is an identity to an individual, the more effective it is in impacting this person's perception, motivation, and behavior. It is noteworthy that one's personal identity and individual self interest are primarily defined in reference to other individuals, whereas social identity and collective interest are primarily defined in reference to other collectivities.
Hi, my name is Sharaf, and I shall be talking about the IC and moral obligation to others. So in this one particular subject, there's an argument that moral obligation to outgroup and others is lower than the moral obligation to in-group and others in all of society. For example, this basically means that people tend to treat their friends better than they tend to treat strangers. So there are two reasons why collectivists may feel even less moral obligation toward outgroups that than individualists. IC research has found that collectivist societies, for example, the Chinese, are more likely to prescribe particularistic norms and standards for treating people differently depending on whether they are in group or out group. Whereas individualist societies, for example, the United States, prescribe a universalistic norm of dealing with all others with ethical consistency. Second, to the extent desirable ends to self are used by transaction parties to justify morally questionable means towards outgroups, collectivists can appeal to self-interest, in-group interest, or both to justify opportunistic behavior against outgroups, whereas individualists rely primarily on self-interest justifications. Finally, to the extent collectivists have stronger social identification with their in-group and endorse their priority of group interest than do individualists, collectivists should have relatively greater moral obligation to both the in-group itself and its individual members. When opportunistic behavior towards outgroups are expected to bring benefits to the in-group, but sanctions to the individual actor, given that self-sacrifice is highly valued in collectivist societies, acting opportunistically on behalf of in-group interests becomes morally less repugnant to collectivists. There ha there has been a number of propositions which led to the study of how are treating in groups and out groups, and they are basically divided into three of them. The first is a transaction between the self and in group, so basically people who are going to be interacting with their friends and or family. The transaction between self and out groups, where people are meant to deal with strangers, and transaction between groups where it's all mixed. So when the proposition of transaction between self and in-groups was taken, it was shown that the intergroup transactions that occur between the self and other individual members of the group, it seems that cross-cultural research has generated consistent and abundant evidence that collectivists in-group situations exhibit more pro-social attitudes and behaviors than do individualists. So the proposals are as follow for this one. When there is a conflict of interest between self and in-group, the individualist will have a greater opportunistic propensity than that of the collectivist. And the second one is when there is a conflict of interest between self and in-group, the individualist will have the greater opportunistic propensity than the collectivist. So when it came to deciding the propositions for the transaction between the self and the outgroup, there was a completely different kind of factor to be considered, because the transaction with the outgroup include those between the self and a collectivity of which the self is not a member, or those between the self and individual members of that outgroup, which causes transactions and the bond between self and peers debilitate due to common group identification being absent. And so the collectivist self is largely free from the moral obligation or social pressure to collectivistic individuals in small groups. So this leads to two proposition. The first one being, when there is a conflict interest between self and outgroup, the collectivist will have a greater opportunistic propensity than will the individualist. And secondly, when there is a conflict of interest between self and outgroup individual, the collectivist will have a greater opportunistic propensity than will the individualist. When it comes to discussing the propositions for transactions between groups, empirical research has shown that collectivist group members showed consistent in-group favoritism, whereas individualists showed in-group favoritism only when the in-group enhances self-esteem and self-interest. So in this case, collectivists and individualists are both put together in the same kind of scenario, and this leads to collectivists being given more priority to the in-group interest, but also they'll be more willing to fight on behalf of their in-group against the out-group, employing all possible means, including guileful ones. Again, due to salience of social identities and strong group identifications, collectivists are more sensitive to the intergroup cues, hence more vulnerable to social categorization and more indifference towards outgroups. The proposition here would be that when there is a conflict of interest between an in-group and an out-group, the collectivist will have a greater opportunistic propensity on behalf of the in-group than will the individualist. So the contribution of TCE is very great, to the extent that organizations in a given society are likely to be managed by top managers holding the predominant cultural values such as individualism or collectivism, and that the strategic choices made by these organizations embody these top managers' value system. It is possible to argue that organizational decisions made by these top managers may follow some of the logic outlined above. In a nutshell, the cultural perspective we propose in this article specifies that when transacting with in-groups and others in in-groups, individualists will tend to be more opportunistic than collectivists, and that when transacting with out-groups and out-group others, collectivists will tend to be more opportunistic than individualists. So the reason why TC is claimed as true by Williamson in 1985 is because the conversion of crude assumption of opportunism into one that takes cultural difference into consideration. Secondly, this is to specify the trade-offs involved when dealing with potential and real problems of opportunism in different cultures. And thirdly, this limits the degree. The degree has to be limited of the freedom when making sweeping statements on opportunism. The research implications imply that cultural generalization would be that individualists are more likely to be opportunistic both, and the fact that collectivists and individualists could be opportunistic depending on relational factors. Researchers should resist making blanket comparisons between cultures, but instead should conduct business transactions within and between small work groups, departments, organizations, and countries. The propositions are believed to extend the effect of IC to individual differences within a given culture as long as there is a sufficient individual variation on IC. Furthermore, research on opportunistic propensity can be conducted in relation to different dimensions or subtypes. This finally leads to the practical implications and the end of this study, which comes up in three results. Okay, so first, the cultural perspective calls for better sensitivity to opportunistic and is supported by future empirical research. The dominant problem of opportunism in individualist cultures seems to be seeking self-interest at the expense of others, regardless of one key to curbing such individualist opportunism is the alignment of self-interest with the interest of others. The dominant problem of opportunism may be of an intergroup nature, namely seeking in-group interests at the expense of other individuals or groups. Secondly, TCE, enriched by the cultural perspective, may also suggest appropriate governance mechanisms to deal with inter-organizational opportunism. This may orient them toward proactively laying down specific legal protections uncharacteristic of what collectivists consider a trustful in-group relationship. Overall, a lack of mutual understanding of the cultural preferences and their implications for opportunistic propensity could easily lead to business failure when doing business. According to Williamson, who came up with the concept of TCE, he says that every stream of research has strengths and weaknesses and stands to benefit from good critics. The the entire study that we have displayed here on this presentation was quite complex because it dealt with the very nature of humanity. Different cultures have different perspectives on how to treat strangers and how to treat family, and obviously that will lead into people's business lives and any other aspect of life, really. An interesting thing to note about this study was that I personally felt like it was a lot about how people dealt with other people. And an interesting thing about this in the Canadian perspective is that a good example would be how French Canadians, such as people living in Quebec or Montreal, they tend to hang more towards people who speak French. I have had reports of people being discriminated because they're not able to speak proper French or not able to speak at all, and like they're treated with much more hostility than people who speak French, even if they are not white Canadians. Comparatively, if you go to any other place of Canada, like BC or Alberta, you'll see notice of how people tend to trust outgroups even more because outgroups tend to bring in more job opportunities. For example, Alberta has been a growing state for the last 20 years, and this is due to the fact that more and more immigrants are moving to Alberta for a better life, for more jobs, and this is creating more positions, more housing, and like this trust of outgroup has indirectly managed to increase the status of these states. So the Canadian perspective, so this would be the Canadians' perspective on the entire topic of in-groups and out-groups. Um, Thank you very much.